years ago. But Nayib Bukele says most of the documents have been destroyed since then. Soldiers backed by the US killed nearly 1,000 people in 1981. It took 31 years for El Salvador's government to acknowledge its role in the massacre.
The government asked for a search, and this is what we found. All of the documents we recovered were from the Joint Staff of the Armed Forces, where we assume they took part in or had something to do with the massacre. This will be officially handed over to the judge and will also be handed over to the Attorney General's office.
The El Mozote massacre is the only atrocity committed during El Salvador's civil war to make it to trial in the country's courts. The presiding judge has been seeking military information about the operations leading to the massacre, but the Defense Ministry has resisted those requests. The U.S. government's also been asked to provide documents on the massacre, which was perpetrated by a U.S.-trained Special Forces battalion. At the time, many Salvadoran officers were receiving treatment and training in the now infamous School of the Americas at Fort Benning. That was part of the Reagan administration's effort to contain what it perceived as the threat of communism in Latin America. Well, Jo Marie Bird, who's a professor at George Mason University's Scar School of Policy and Government, is joining me now by Skype from Washington. Thank you very much indeed for giving us your time, ma'am. Is it fair to speculate that the president is prepared to make this offer because there's a good chance that many of those documents have been destroyed by previous governments and there might not be many left?
Well, I think it's important to clarify that the president of El Salvador said last year that he would open up the military archives, and he has refused until this date to live up to that promise. The judge went on Monday in a prearranged meeting to receive the documents, and he was they rejected his entrance into the archives. And so to date, the president has refused to comply with what is essentially an international mandate. Back in 2012, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights issued a judgment in the case of El Salvador, the El Mozote case versus the state of El Salvador, and found the government of El Salvador responsible for the massacre and ordered, among other things, an investigation and prosecution and punishment of those responsible, and it ordered the declassification of all government and military archives, and that to date has not happened.
Why is there any indication that just because, as you say, the president has made this statement now, that the same thing isn't going to happen again and the military will close its doors and the documents will not be released? Is there any likelihood, do you think, that anybody that's related to the people that were caught up in that massacre might get any sort of closure at any point?
Well, I mean, it is important to note that the case is on trial in El Salvador. This is the first, as you mentioned in your report a moment ago, this is the first and only case of atrocities committed by the Salvadoran army during the internal armed conflict between 1980 and 1992 that has gone to trial. 18 senior military officials are on trial in this case, including the former Minister of Defense, who was in effect the head of state between 1979 and 1983, General Garcia, who was deported from the United States in 2015 after trying to seek asylum here, which was rejected, and he was sent back to El Salvador. And initially, nothing happened to him because there was an amnesty law that was passed right after the Truth Commission issued its report in 1992, which shielded any military or police official from criminal prosecution. However, in 2016, the Constitutional Court of El Salvador struck down that amnesty law, paving the way for criminal trials like the El Mozote trial. However, I mean, it is important to note that though this is a really important case, there are dozens of other cases that are being investigated but have not yet come to trial. So the political will to achieve accountability for terrible atrocities committed in the context of the Salvadoran Civil War, remains very lacking in El Salvador, unfortunately.
And of course, playing a key role in this was, as we talked about, the U.S. government, because it was training special forces, or at least there was a special forces battalion that had been trained by the U.S. It would be fascinating to find out what the U.S.'s involvement in all of this was. Is there any likelihood that we're ever going to get that kind of information?
So, I mean, absolutely, that is critical. So the U.S. not only trained the Atlacatl battalion that carried out this massacre, it also provided, and if I'm not mistaken, the number is $5 billion over the course of this 12-year civil war in support of a brutal military dictatorship, routinely lied to the American people about the nature of that military government, and continue to channel funds and training illegally into El Salvador in support of death squads and violent military operations such as the El Mozote massacre. So I think it's important not only for Salvadoran citizens to access U.S. records as well as the Salvadoran military's records, it's also important for American citizens. That was taxpayer money that went to fund death squads. We have a right to know who sent that money, why they sent that money, and who's responsible ultimately.
Just very briefly, how do Salvadorans nowadays view this, given the fact it happened in 1981? We are a generation or so past that. What has been the policy of the government, and are Salvadorans actually cognizant of just how important this was?
Right, that's a really good question. I mean, when the peace process occurred in 91 and 92, one of the things both parties, the government of El Salvador and the FMLN guerrilla movement, agreed to was a truth commission. And the Truth Commission produced a report about the human rights abuses that took place in El Salvador and found that, I forget the exact number, but something like 85% of all the human rights abuses that they documented, some 75,000 killings, were the responsibility of the armed forces, and a smaller number the responsibility of the FMLN, and then a smaller number undetermined. That report has essentially been buried by the Salvadoran government. The Salvadoran government since then, for several decades, had a policy of official forgetting, denial of government responsibility for human rights abuses, and a policy of turning the page. Let's not look backwards. Let's focus on our current problems. And it is true that El Salvador has many current problems: persistent poverty, extreme inequality, gang violence, criminal violence, official corruption. So there are many current problems. But that does not mean that El Salvador can simply turn the page and not hold to account those responsible for these atrocities. And so victims and their allies in the human rights movement, both locally and internationally, have done a lot of work to preserve memory in El Salvador and to push for full truth-telling and for full accountability. They've had limited successes so far, but the overturning of the amnesty law, the opening of the El Mozote massacre case with the senior military officials on trial in this case, and more recently, the conviction in Spain of a colonel for the murder of the 6 Jesuits, their housekeeper, and his daughter in 1989. These are signs that, that policy of forgetting, of denying, actually cannot last forever, as the official story would like, the government story would like.
We really appreciate you giving us the benefit of your expertise and your knowledge on this. Jo Marie Butt, we appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me.